everyone, it's Edna here. In today's video I'd like to tell you a story. The story is about Hélène de Montgeroult, a French woman born to the privileged class of the aristocracy in 1764. Now, this woman was known as one of the best pianists of her time. And this is quite amazing given the fact that she belonged to the aristocracy and therefore was not supposed to play in public and not having any public figure as a musician. So she was known, she had this reputation in spite of not being a public figure, and just by the fact that all the musicians of her time knew her and respected her tremendously. So she had Clementi and Dussek, they were coming to her home and they were teaching her, great, great teachers. And Viotti, for example, which was the greatest violinist of his time, was her partner of chamber music. And many other French musicians of this time were actually guests and came to her home to make music together. Now, in 1789 came the French Revolution, and as an aristocrat she was in a precarious position. In 1791 they decided to escape France with her husband, and unfortunately for them they were caught by the Austrians on the Italian border. So her husband was imprisoned and died in prison, and she was left with nothing because the Austrians took all the possessions, they took all her jewels, and she didn't know what to do. She went back to Paris. Back in Paris she was imprisoned because she was an aristocrat, and an aristocrat who tried to escape and who had some dealings with the Austrians. Doesn't matter that her husband died in prison. So that's where actually her past as a musician saved her, because all the musicians in Paris went to the judging committee and said, listen, you really cannot kill this woman, which would have been the normal end of the story. Normally she would have been guillotined. And they said, you just can't do that, so please spare her life. So the judging committee brings a forte piano. So you have to think that pianos in those days were rather small and they were easily transportable. I mean, two people, it was like a little cupboard to transport. And they bring a forte piano to the hall where she is judged, and they ask her to improvise on the Marseillaise. Improvising on the Marseillaise enabled her, of course, to show that she's a great pianist, that she's a great improviser, but also it was a political statement saying, okay, I'm embracing the revolution, I'm part of this society now. And that's actually what saved her life, and that's how she became the first woman to teach in the Paris Conservatory. Now, what it also enabled her was actually to publish, because that was suddenly a woman could publish under her own name music. So she did publish before, but that was actually under the name of Viotti. That's interesting to note. But from 1788 to 1812, she wrote a lot of music. And in 1812, she decides to publish everything under her own name. Now, that's quite an amazing story. And I did a lecture in the Royal College about that, and I was asked by students, like, what makes her music special? So one of the things is that she wrote 114 etudes, which is very original, because you have to think that she's a contemporary of Mozart and Beethoven, who did not write etudes. And the first etudes that became well known in the repertoire for piano were the etudes of Chopin, which were written around the 1830s. So you have to think 1812, everything published, 114 etudes published, that's quite original. Now, what makes these etudes original is the fact that she is really interested in the instrument, in the piano, in the forte piano, I should say, because you have to think that the instrument, the forte piano, became popular in the 1760s, and that in the 1790s, at least in France, it actually replaced the harpsichord. The harpsichord was seen as an old instrument that belonged actually to the aristocracy. So came along this new instrument, this new keyboard instrument, and Hélène de Montgeroult had a real passion for this instrument, and she really wanted to see to what extent you can do things with it. So she was trying to exactly write etudes to study this new form, to study this new instrument, and to see what are the expressive possibilities and the technical possibilities which are hidden in this new instrument, which was actually all the time evolving in the next 30 years. So you have to think that what makes a difference between the etudes of Chopin and the etudes of Hélène de Montgeroult is a lot of differences, but of course one of the facts is that the etudes of Montgeroult were written 40 years before, and they were written for a very different instrument. So that's an instrument that is actually in the midst of an evolution. And in the time of Chopin, it sort of reached a certain aesthetic, which is very different than the aesthetic of 1788. So that's quite a fascinating point, I find. So I recorded a CD in 2017 for Orchid Classics, in which I actually recorded 12 etudes, taken a bit from each part of her chronology, so some of the beginning, some in the middle, and some at the end. And it's very interesting to note that the style in which she writes is very much in advance of her time. So if you think that she writes in 1788, which is, you know, Mozart and Beethoven, suddenly you hear an etude which sounds a little bit like Schumann. I'd like, in the next series of videos, I'd like to dedicate to the first volume of her publication. I mean, she published everything under what she calls her method, a complete course for piano. And the idea of this publication was also to help those who do not have access to a good piano teaching, to help them learn piano through her method. So she explains everything. She explains how to do things, how to hold your hand, how to play certain patterns and all that. And she says, like, with this method, you can really learn within a year to be able to play piano. That's why I'd like to make a video and also explain what she says, translate it into English. And you can find her scores on imslp.org. Now, at the end of this video, I will put an excerpt of an etude that I recorded in 2016. And that's actually part from the recording session. Hope to see you next time. Bye.